sex for favors, secrets, cover-ups, corruption. I'm gonna show you things that will blow your mind. And now, here is the full story. Like, come on. Like, what an absolute wet fart of a conclusion. Absolutely, what a train wreck Gamergate 2 has become. What a complete and total joke. It really needs to be said that Gamergate survived, Medicare being a pussy ass bitch and fucking off at the first opportunity. It survived the internet blood sports. People like Ethan Ralph coming in and like making it all about himself and his personal drama and his nonsense. It survived like all manner of degeneracy, grifters, just all sorts of insane, just delusional people. Okay, I would go so far as to say like pretty much everyone involved with Gamergate in some way, shape, or form was a grifter. Right now, everybody they were right, that video game journalism is corrupt, but that's kind of that's pretty self-evident if you spend any amount of time like reading game journals at all. Everyone knows it's true, so Gamergate like coming out and saying it wasn't some huge revelation, right? But the thing about Gamergate that really made it such a huge monumental like milestone gamer culture thing is that it was the beginning of the end of like woke culture in America, right? That really Gamergate by itself, made the backlash towards that kind of ideology mainstream. It by association got Donald Trump elected. We've been seeing like this slow, gradual like death of communism in America. And again, we still have a long way to go, before we get to the point where we can, openly talk about, say the Epstein client list or whatever. Yeah, they're still like digging their heels in situations like that. But it is very clear to me that the era of like the golden age of like control and like gaslighting people to believe like insane nonsense is over. And it just isn't going to survive the next like 20, 30 years. And a big part of that, I think, is just going to be like the failures of woke ideologues as people. Like it's going to become more stereotypical to like make fun of like career women, of like leftists, of just like the abject failures of what they've done. 2020 like in particular has kind of been a milestone year, I think, in getting the general public to stop with like the worship of certain demographics. Like it we're definitely seeing the culture shift now, and it's a very real thing now. But as it so happens, like because Gamergate is so played out and so like was such a pivotal aspect of like this cultural shift, you have seen a lot of people try and cling on to it to the point where it straight up came back as Gamergate 2, Electric Boogaloo, the sequel that nobody asked for, that nobody cared about, and honestly completely lost sight of everything that the original Gamergate stood for. Because Gamergate initially was about like how game journalists were propping up like really mediocre products to like support their friends and to support like the ideology and stuff like that. Gone Home, a game that nobody talks about or remembers anymore, was like the 2013 game of the year for a lot of outlets because of how it like pushed the ideology onto people, right? The Last of Us was a huge deal at the time. It took years, the sequel coming out, for people to realize it was always garbage. But Gamergate happening was essentially the beginning of the end of people taking game journalists seriously. No longer were people automatically taking 10 out of 10 out of 10s from IGN like gospel. Okay, people were beginning to speak out against like products that people were hyping up. The PS4 was known online to not have any games. All these major tentpole IPs that were propped up in the 90s and 2000s, like Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy, and the like, slowly started to collapse. Gamergate was the beginning of the end, the beginning of today's gaming crash. And like, if you've been following me for a long time, that I have been talking about this. This has been documented. This is something that I've been talking about on message boards, on forums for like, over a decade, just ranting about how the gaming crash was inevitable and how all the third parties were going to have to kneel to Nintendo. How Nintendo was going to be the only company that would survive the gaming crash. And I was vindicated. As far as I know, I'm the only person who completely predicted what was going to happen in that period. That Nintendo was going to stop the competition with the release of their next platform, that they would dominate the industry, become the market leader. Not that they already weren't, but establish themselves as the uncontested market leader, I suppose is the correct term to use. Nintendo would win everything, and the game journals would fight and claw their way to try and deny reality. And you still see that today with the Switch too, where you're seeing it flying off store shelves. You're seeing Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza be these huge, huge hits, and you're still seeing the community try and ignore it and try to write it off. Not only that, but they're straight up trying to demonize Nintendo right now. Nobody really wants to admit the elephant in the room, right? There are very real problems with the gaming industry, always have been, but they don't want to address, the companies behind it. They don't want to blame Sony, they don't want to blame Microsoft, and they especially don't want to blame Valve. Okay, these companies are supposed to be the cool alternative consoles. These were supposed to be the consoles that saved us from the evil tyranny of Nintendo, which was a much smaller Japanese company than Microsoft or Sony. It's what the core issue with Gamergate, I felt is that people never really put two and two together. They made it overly political. They didn't talk about the actual industry politics. They didn't talk about the actual consoles, and they certainly didn't address the one company that was not and is still not affected by woke culture at all. That has still produced high quality games. Throughout its entire existence, Nintendo. You still see people try to downplay events say Satoru Iwata slashing his executive pay and the entire board with it to keep everyone employed at Nintendo during their one that 1 year where they lost money. They try and write stuff off. They try and write off Pokemon becoming the biggest brand in the world, or the Wii and DS being such huge cultural phenomenons, and the success of the Switch and Breath of the Wild, and there's just countless examples of this, right? The narrative has always been that Nintendo is bad, they're the worst, they're the most evil company in existence, and the reality is so far removed from that, it's kind of laughable. Gamergate, in a sense, completely failed to acknowledge reality. That all of the issues that you were seeing with PlayStation, Xbox, and PC games at the time that have still been continuing to this day simply were not present on Nintendo consoles, right? We did not get unfinished games. We did not get broken games. The consoles were great. The developers are Nintendo is the most, it is the best place to work for in Japan right now because of how well put together they are. I think people really underestimate just how well run Nintendo is as a business. And it's always shocking to me to see just how many people in the industry genuinely seem to have believed that Nintendo was on the verge of shutting down or becoming bankrupt. That to me has obviously been laughably stupid. And it's only getting worse and worse with time. More and more evident that that's not going to happen with time. But the reason I'm bringing all this up, the reason I wanted to talk about this today is that you had the core issue of Gamergate, right? You had the real problem was that the consumer base gamers were beginning to notice that the product was declining in quality, and obviously they blame politics, they blame woke culture. Nothing to do with it. The real issue was that the Western gaming industry world, they never cultivated talent. They never learned how to produce good games. All they did was just invest everything into graphics, making everything as realistic as possible. And that worked for a brief period of time from 2007 to 2012, but then it instantly collapsed, after that because producing games became too expensive, right? The real problem was just the fact that Western gaming is not and never has been as good as Japanese gaming in general. Obviously there are exceptions, but generally speaking, that is true. So like anybody who's like a real genuine enthusiast will tell you that. Okay, people may cope about like Ultima or whatever, but guess what? Ultima, first of all, was never as popular as like its console equivalents anyway, and they haven't made a new one in like decades at this point. So you need to grow up and move on. So yeah, again, you have like situations like that, right, where you have a clearly superior alternative to Western gaming in the Japanese gaming sphere. You have a superior console to the westernized consoles, and yet like everybody just ignored it. Everybody just refused to like face reality and face facts that Nintendo was just a better option. So what has happened over the past decade, and I saw this happen like even when Gamergate was still in full swing. This is stuff like I was seeing happen in like the 2014, 2015, 2016 period, especially. The narrative shifted from complaining about the declining quality of games in general to specifically claiming about censorship of Japanese games. Like usually they would like claim that the text or the meaning of the story was changed in like localization, which is not and never has been true. Like that's not how it works. They can't make like major changes to the plots or characters. Like the most they can do is like change specific lines, okay? Like and recontextualize things. It's like you can't like completely rewrite the script of like a game by censoring it's just such a giant cope. But like at the time, that was the angle they were going with. Like this idea that like the evil woke Western developers, like the primary thing they were trying to do at the time was censoring Japanese games because they were just too sexy. Ooh. So like instead of like talking about the quality of the games, like how much people wanted to play them, how replayable at all, the genre, the console they were on, the developer, anything about the games themselves, really the entire conversation of Gamergate shifted from being about like overall quality and like the overall just fun factor of the games themselves to like complaining about something that really never was an issue to begin with, like localization. Gamergate was essentially co-opted by these kind of people to complain about something that really was not an issue to begin with. And this is not like a new thing, a new phenomenon. Like I've always said that like Gamergate's issue was that like you had the political side of it and you had like the gooner side of it, and like both sides like split or like had some overlap and stuff like that, but like both were completely missing the point of what the actual problem was. That's the core issue, is that gooners hyperfixated on this one specific thing, like there aren't enough pretty women in games, instead of talking about the real issue. Like never mind the fact that is not and never has been true in general, but it's absurd, seeing what the online gaming community has become, to the point where like I really don't, over the past 5 years, ever since like the Rekieta Law thing and like me interacting with like some of these people in the sphere, getting to know them a little bit, watching some of their content, like I have gone like full tilt into hating like anime waifu bait like nonsense. Like that's kind of my mentality on this, because like seeing these gooners like and just how they treat like their drawings of like little girls or whatever, it's like it is downright disturbing. Like all the copes they have about how it's like it's better than having a real GF, and like how it's all just a fantasy and it's all just fun, bro. It's all just a gigantic cope, like waifuism is not healthy. It's not good for you. It's not a good look. Okay. And I think like, more well-adjusted people in the community would like be willing to tell you that. But like, we always get like labeled as normies or like out of touch or boomers or whatever. Like they think they got it going on. They think that like, watching a VTuber with like 10,000 other guys is like the same as having like an actual woman to talk to. It's like it's so no, better than an actual woman to talk to. And like obviously they're coping, they're delusional about that, but um like this is the issue with Gamergate, really, is that like these people are so obsessive, so terminally online that they are completely out of touch with like how people actually think, what they actually act, like what the problems actually are, and like what should be done to correct them. Because seeing this happen, like seeing setting the stage for for Gamergate 2 was just like even back then was just this embarrassing thing. Like just downright embarrassing to see this happen. Seeing people like lose the plot so much, continue to seethe about Nintendo, complaining about Xenoblade Chronicles X, removing a boob slider, complaining about Tokyo Mirage Sessions, pretending it was censored by changing some of the costumes, and culminating in Fire Emblem Fates' localization, which has this reputation for being this like horrible like botched thing, when in reality, the problems with the script can be traced back to like the original. This is something these people don't understand, is that the script for Fire Emblem Fates was not good to begin with. It had a lot of problems in the original text. So again, like breaking all that down for you has been, we have to give context, okay, as to like what's going on now, okay, because in spite of all of this, in spite of like the splintering and all the issues with like Gamergate was still like very very relevant because people were beginning to like notice things about certain people in the industry. Neil Druckmann kicked out like that other guy at Naughty Dog and took full control. He started producing like Heretic, The Last of Us Part 2, the HBO show. Neil Druckmann is a joke. He was propped up as this like, messiah of gaming, but in reality was just this like complete and total tool, right? Everybody knows it. Everybody's been talking about it. But like the thing that's changed, since then is that industry people are beginning to speak out against woke culture. So like, we've gone past the point where this was some like weird underground like fringe thing, consumers complaining about the declining products. You have like people in the industry that will try and grift off of Gamergate, that will try and like release statements like implying they're based to try and boost their own careers. Like there was like another example of a guy like the Days Gone director, right? Like that's what he tries to tell people, that like, well, the real reason Days Gone failed was because Game Journals didn't like it because it wasn't woke enough. Like in reality, he's coping. The game's not good. Nobody cares about it. It's like it's some generic zombie game. Okay, like we are fed up with zombie games. Okay, like, but that's an example of what Grummz would later go on to do successfully. The idea of this dev who has this long history of working on great games like uh I don't know. Like oh man, World of Warcraft. Yeah, that's the big project Grummz is known for. Like wow, you worked on WoW. Just unbelievable. One of the most like overhyped, just grindy, just repetitive, boring, uninspired, derivative. Like oh man, I worked on WoW. Like that's your claim to fame. So you have like Grummz, like a Blizzard alumni, coming out like I can't get my any new projects off the ground because I'm a stupid fraud who has spent the past 25 years like seething about Nintendo. Like so like he changes gears. Okay, he stops like being a game dev and he decides to become like a cat turd clone. He decides he's going to become a Twitter grifter and start complaining what other better developers are doing on Twitter. And that's like the reality of the Grummz situation, by the way. Like, I don't care how woke you are. I don't care like how terrible your game is. Like, at least you're putting out a product. Objectively speaking, you are a better game dev than Grummz because you are putting out a product. It doesn't matter how bad it is. So Grummz is like, he is this shining example of just how Gamergate has built up this like this complete fraudulent like this hack of right, this complete like nobody who's like worshipped by the community because like oh he's our guy. It doesn't matter how insipid his takes are. It doesn't matter how like how how little he's put out, as an actual game developer. It doesn't matter that he hasn't worked on Blizzard in some time. All he does is sit there and blame woke culture for everything wrong at Blizzard, when in reality the problems were like have been very prevalent there for a long time. Like the reality is Blizzard was never really that great of a developer to begin with, and it's just something that like PC gamers don't ever want to hear. As early as like as recently as like Overwatch's release, people were still like hyping them up as like the greatest dev in history when they've made like what, like a handful of games. So again, like Blizzard was like one of those venerated like worship names in gaming, like especially in the PC community, and Grummz like capitalized that for his grift. So he's not talking about like real issues in the gaming scene. He's not talking about like how developers are treated, or like how resources are allocated, or like cool like insider stuff, like actual insider stuff. No. Like according to Grummz and a lot of people in Gamergate too, the actual problem is that developers do not make enough pretty women in games. To these guys, this is like the core issue. Like this guy is seriously like sitting there seething. This 57-year-old like Korean dude, like, oh man, like why is my waifu like slightly over? I don't know. Like, oh, why does she have a man jaw, man? Like, she looks like Brock Lesnar. Like, like I don't know what these guys are like. I don't know like what he says exactly, but like it's pretty clear that like a big part of his grift right now is complaining about like, female characters not being like overly sexualized, like, he's been like, on the forefront of like hyping up slap like Stellar Blade. He's yeah, Black Myth Wukong, conveniently, and I have noticed this a lot, conveniently ignoring all the Nintendo equivalents. So, like, all the very well received, like, female characters that have come out in recent years, people like, say, Bayonetta, or, like, the Fire Emblem Engage chicks, or, like, some of the Princess Peach Showtime stuff. Let's just ignore how good all of that is, and just focus instead on this, like, oh man, Joanna Dark, like, oh she, like, again, like, this has always been like the giant cope when it comes to these game devs, is that they never like admitting that Nintendo is like doing well at all. Like they'll never do it unless like they straight up just have to acknowledge it in some way. Like you'll never see them talk about Nintendo positively. You'll never see them praise their games or their characters or what have you. Like they may as well not exist. And I do think that is like my core issue with like Gamergate 2 as a concept is like, why are you not talking about the actual video games that are being made and coming out? Like what are you doing, bro? Like, there's no denying that like Donkey Kong Bonanza, Mario Kart World, the Switch 2 are like these huge deals in gaming right now, like phenomenons, like cultural things, and it's just like the online gaming community is just like, oh, I'd rather like celebrate Perfect Dark being canceled because Joanna Dark looked ugly. It's like, huh? Like to me, what I think like the shift from Gamergate to Gamergate 2 like primarily signifies is that like the culture shift. So like when Gamergate like first came out, when that was a thing, like we were the counterculture, right? But now with Gamergate 2, we're mainstream culture where like, people are clearly like moving away from like woke ideology and like detesting it and hating it, everything and stuff like that. It's becoming more mainstream. So like they're more mainstream about like, it's more mainstream to like, speak up about this kind of thing and like be open about it, but it's resulting in the same problem in which people who are like true believers of the movement are like speaking out about things that like really don't matter at all. Like how exactly would changing Joanna Dark's face fix Perfect Dark? It's an FPS. Like, how many times do you even see her face? Like, unless you like look at like the box art or like in cutscenes or anything. Like, who cares? Like, I don't know. It's just like It's an FPS. Like, you're really complaining about the way your female protagonist looks in a first-person shooter. It's like, it's so tone deaf and so out of touch with like what the actual issues in gaming really are. And I do think that kind of sums up like Gamergate 2 as a whole, is that like it's not addressing the actual problems that we're seeing in the industry, because we are in a cultural shift. We are seeing the industry changing. I think for the better. You know, Nintendo is more openly acknowledged now. It's not like mainstream to hate them the way you used to. Like there used to be like all this like coping and seething about them constantly. Like outside of like, you know, some pitiable attempts at like downplaying Mario Kart, Pokemon, and Bonanza. You know, we haven't seen any of that this generation. You know, I saw the Mish come out and try to say like, actually, this is the most hated I've ever seen Nintendo, and I couldn't help but laugh at him. Like, what a little kid. You know, oh my sweet summer child. Like, you weren't here during the Wii U days. You know, he seriously tried to sit there and be like, well, I've been a Nintendo YouTuber for many years. Like, for the Switch generation. Okay, you were not here during the Wii U period when like everyone hated Nintendo before the console came out. You know how like every one of their franchises was like hated and despised by the community for like all sorts of insane reasons, and like you weren't there to see the slow gradual shift where like, you know, things like this were just kind of like slowly condemned. You know, like, you know, people talk about this with like Mario Kart World, like, oh man, 8 Deluxe was way better, you know, like completely forgetting how controversial 8 was when it was first shown off, you know, like it's like these people don't understand how this works. It's like it's gonna be really interesting, like getting to the point where people are like openly praising Tears of the Kingdom and openly praising Mario Kart World. Actually, we're already kind of seeing that now, but like it's a really interesting situation seeing how the community is like rallying to try and keep like the illusion alive for like just a little bit longer. Because like I do think this is true. Like I think Grummz and like his ilk like hate Nintendo far more than woke culture. Like this isn't something like you'll ever see them like openly admit. But like you'll see them praise like, you know, woke projects like The Last of Us, or like, you know, older indie games, and like even stuff that's coming out right now. You will never ever see them praise Nintendo titles. And I do think like this is the core issue we're seeing with the gaming community right now, is that like a significant chunk of games are just seen as like by the community as not being relevant because they're exclusively on Nintendo Switch. You know, like we've already seen like a lot of games come out on Switch 2 that have been downplayed and ignored by the community, and that number is only going to increase as we continue down this path and continue learning more. Like as more and more games start coming out, it's just like, you know, the community still doesn't allow you to like talk about how good Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is, or Xenoblade or No More Heroes 3, or Metroid Dread, or Showtime, Brothership, Tears of the Kingdom still gets a lot of pushback. You know, Mario Kart World had this like incredibly insane, like delusional backlash towards it. Like these are all great games that are going to stand the test of time, and I consistently do not see Grummz and his followers talking about them ever. And that is the real problem with Gamergate. That the good games get downplayed and ignored, while bad ones are the ones that are talked about and worshipped.